Hello, everybody. This is Jim Ransom. I'm going to read you some poems by Christian Wiman. This is Morning Jim Poetry, and I'm trying very hard not to give you too much background. Christian Wiman may be well known to all of you. After all, he was the editor of Poetry Magazine back in the early part of this century. And at the age of 39, he was diagnosed with a form of bone cancer, and he began cancer treatments. Several years later, he underwent a bone marrow transplant that was successful, and that's a little dicey because sometimes they do fail. And it appears now that he has successfully recovered. He's lived nearly 10 years now since that was done. And he's always been a Christian, but he was challenged with his beliefs when he was diagnosed. But in the end, it made his Christian beliefs deeper. During this trial, he wrote a book that some of you may have read. It's extremely well written, beautiful book, My Bright Abyss, Meditations on a Modern Believer. Meditations of a Modern Believer, Christian Wiman. And it has some of his poetry in it. We'll cover a couple of those today. And the book was written while he was still in the challenging period of intermittent treatments and then relapses and so on and so forth, which he has now overcome. So I'm going to read you initially a poem entitled From a Window. It's in this book, it's in my Bright Abyss. From a Window by Christian Wiman. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically, as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pane as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision, over the house and heavenwards. Of course, I knew those leaves were birds. Of course, that old tree stood exactly as it had and would. But why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life, to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. He said he wrote this poem a few months after getting his diagnosis. And there was nothing planned or deliberate about it, according to him. I didn't have the realization, he says, that an experience of reality can open into an experience of divinity and then go write a poem to illustrate my feelings. No, it was quite the reverse. He wrote the poem out of anguish, and only later did he divine the meaning of it. So that's From a Window. Now, the next poem is one that has not been published, as far as I know, any place but in My Bright Abyss, and it's actually untitled. It's from a handful of poems he wrote about the same time. But it has a different impetus than the first one. It's more of a downer poem, I guess you might say. And here it is, untitled poem. It is good to sit even a rotting body in sunlight uncompromised by God or lack of God, to see the bee beyond all the plundered flowers ere stagger toward you, and like a delicate helicopter hover above your knee until it finds you to be not sweet, but at least not flinching, its hair legs on the hair of your leg, silvering a coolness through you like a soul of nerve. You notice there's no God in this poem, and he sort of pushes the possibility roughly to the side. And he has not sent that poem in for publication except in this book, because I think what he's trying to tell us is that he's been of many minds about God and his place in this world. In fact, you could call it an anti-devotional devotional poem. I'll let you try to figure out what that means. Now, here's another one that has been published, and I think maybe in Poetry Magazine or perhaps in one of his books. And this one is called This Inwardness, This Ice. This inwardness, this ice, this wide boreal whiteness into which he's come with a crawling sort of care for the sky's severer blue, the edge on the air, trusting his own lightness and the feel as feeling goes, this discipline, this glaze, this cold opacity of days begins to crack. No marks, not one scar, no sign of where they are, these weaknesses rumoring through, growing loud if he stays, louder if he comes back. Nothing to do but move, nowhere to go but on, to creep and breathe and learn a blue beyond belief, an air too sharp to pause this distance, this burn, this element of flaws that winces as it gives. Nothing to do but live, nowhere to be but gone. This was published in a book called Hard Night. And it was published by Copper Canyon Press. You can probably find it at your library. I think it's an excellent poem, but you sort of have to be in his mood to get the full benefit of it. And his mood was one of, oh, Lord, spare me, but what's going to happen next? It was one of those tough periods of life. And now there's another poem I'd like to read for a final offering here. And it's from the same book, My Bright Abyss. And it's another untitled poem. It's from a section of the book called Variations of Quiet. And I think this poem is one of the variations of quiet that he was trying to describe. So here it is, untitled poem from Variations of Quiet. Too many elegies, elevating sadness to a kind of sad religion. One wants in the end just once to befriend one's own loneliness, to make of the ache of inwardness something, music maybe, or even just believing in it. And summer, and the long room alone, where the child chances on a bee banging. I'll find the page here. Banging against one window pane, like an attack of happiness. Right at the end of that poem, he quotes St. Augustine, and I'll read the quote. We have said this not in order to have said something, but in order not to have remained altogether silent. It's kind of a self-justifying sentence, isn't it? But we remember that Wiman is a lifelong poet. Poets have a hard time being silent. And maybe that's the test of a poet and the test of poetry. Poems hardly ever exist as single items. In other words, no author of poetry is usually able to keep quiet for the rest of his life or her life. Even a poet as quiet as Emily Dickinson wrote a lot of poems, didn't she? And it wasn't until after she was dead, shy person that she was, that somebody in the family took her poems to be published, and they were. I think if Emily had lived longer, the time period between her poems being written and published would have been much greater than it was. So some poets are much more forward with their work than others are. Thanks for joining me today. There's a lot to know about Christian Wiman. He served as editor of Poetry Magazine in the past, but when he developed his cancer, he dropped out of that job. He was the editor for, I would say, 4 or 5 years or more. But he's still out there and he's still writing poetry as far as I know. So we've heard another round of poems by Christian Wiman. I think he's a poet well worth your attention. He writes deceptively simple style poems in deceptively simple language. But his poems are pretty deep, in my opinion. Okay, now, that's it for today, and I hope to see you again next week. Not sure who we'll be covering, but there'll be somebody. Bye now.